Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden stories of Cold War espionage and the real human cost behind intelligence operations, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We uncover these documented cases every week, bringing you the documented truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Now, let's talk about the co-worker's observation that exposed the most damaging spy ring in U.S. Navy history. On the morning of May 19, 1984, Lieutenant Commander David Harrison sat in his office at the Naval Communications Station in Alameda, California, reviewing personnel security files with a growing sense of unease. Harrison, 39 years old, had been serving as the station's security officer for 8 months. Among the files spread across his desk was the personnel folder for Senior Chief Radioman Jerry Alfred Whitworth, a 36-year-old communications specialist who had been stationed at Alameda since July 1983. What troubled Harrison was not any single dramatic incident, but rather an accumulating pattern of small inconsistencies, unexplained absences from secure spaces, unusual interest in materials outside Whitworth's direct responsibilities, and what several colleagues had described as behavioral changes over the previous year. Whitworth's file showed an exemplary service record spanning 17 years. He had joined the Navy in 1956 at age 18, completed radioman training, and had steadily advanced through the enlisted ranks while serving on multiple vessels and shore stations. He held a top-secret security clearance with access to sensitive compartmented information, the highest level of classified material in the military. His performance evaluations were consistently excellent. There was nothing in the official documentation that suggested any cause for concern. But Harrison had learned during his intelligence training that espionage cases rarely began with obvious red flags. They began with patterns that seemed innocuous individually but became significant when viewed collectively. 3 separate personnel at the Alameda Station had mentioned Whitworth to Harrison in recent weeks, each describing minor incidents that troubled them, but that none felt confident enough to formally report. A cryptographic technician named Roger Chen had mentioned that Whitworth had asked detailed questions about communications systems that were outside his operational need to know. A watch supervisor named Patricia Gonzalez had noted that Whitworth sometimes remained in secure spaces after his shift had ended, claiming he was finishing paperwork. A maintenance officer named Thomas Reeves had observed that Whitworth carried his briefcase into restricted areas more frequently than seemed necessary for someone in his position. Harrison had begun compiling these observations into an informal log, not yet constituting an official security investigation, but representing what the Navy called protective monitoring, enhanced attention to an individual's activities based on indicators that, while not definitive, warranted closer scrutiny. On that morning in May 1984, as he reviewed his notes, Harrison made the decision to elevate his concerns to the Naval Investigative Service, the military's law enforcement and counterintelligence agency. What Harrison did not know, what no one in the U.S. military or intelligence community yet fully understood, was that Jerry Whitworth was part of the most damaging espionage operation in American naval history. For more than 7 years, Whitworth had been systematically providing highly classified cryptographic materials to Soviet intelligence through an organization that would become known as the Walker Spy Ring. The damage assessment that would eventually be conducted would conclude that the information Whitworth and his associates provided had compromised virtually every aspect of U.S. Navy communications and had given the Soviet Union the ability to read encrypted American military traffic during some of the most critical years of the Cold War. The story of how Jerry Whitworth came to betray his country, how his activities eventually came under suspicion, and how the exposure of his espionage would devastate multiple families while revealing profound vulnerabilities in American security systems is a narrative that spans more than 3 decades and involves dozens of individuals whose lives would be forever altered by choices made in secret. Jerry Alfred Whitworth was born on August 10, 1939, in Muldrow, Oklahoma, a small town in the eastern part of the state near the Arkansas border. His father, James Whitworth, worked as a farmer and occasional laborer. His mother, Dorothy, worked as a seamstress and helped manage the household finances. The family was not wealthy, but they were stable by the standards of rural Oklahoma in the 1940s and 1950s. Jerry was the second of 4 children, with an older sister, a younger brother, and a younger sister. According to later interviews with family members and childhood acquaintances, Jerry was an intelligent child who performed well in school, particularly in mathematics and science. He was described as somewhat introverted, but not unusually so, a boy who enjoyed reading, working on mechanical projects, and spending time outdoors. His teachers at Muldrow High School remembered him as a capable student who completed his work reliably, but who did not particularly stand out among his peers. In 1956, at age 17, Jerry Whitworth made the decision to enlist in the Navy. According to his later testimony, the motivation was primarily economic. The Navy offered steady employment, technical training, and the possibility of seeing parts of the world beyond rural Oklahoma. For a young man from a farming family with limited financial resources, the military represented an opportunity for advancement and stability. His parents signed the necessary consent forms, and in September 1956, he reported to the Naval Training Center in San Diego, California, for basic training. Whitworth's aptitude test results suggested he would be well suited for technical specialties, and after completing basic training, he was assigned to Radioman School. The Navy's Radioman rating encompassed communications operations, including sending and receiving messages, operating radio equipment, and handling encrypted communications. It was a specialty that required both technical competence and trustworthiness, as radiomen routinely handled classified information. Whitworth completed radioman training in early 1957 and received his first assignment to the USS Constellation, an aircraft carrier being constructed at the New York Naval Shipyard. He served aboard the Constellation during its completion and early operational deployments, learning the practical aspects of naval communications in a fleet environment. By all accounts, he performed his duties competently and adapted well to military life. Throughout the 1960s, Whitworth's Navy career progressed steadily. He advanced through the enlisted pay grades, eventually achieving the senior enlisted rank of Senior Chief Petty Officer. He served on multiple vessels, the USS Niagara Falls, the USS Constellation during its Vietnam War deployments, and several shore stations. He received additional training in cryptographic systems and communications security, expanding his access to increasingly sensitive classified material. In 1960, during a period of shore leave in San Diego, Whitworth met Brenda Lynn Reese at a social gathering for military personnel and local civilians. Brenda was 20 years old at the time, working as a secretary at a law firm in downtown San Diego. The courtship was brief. Whitworth, then 21 years old, was attracted to the stability that marriage promised, and Brenda was drawn to the security of marrying a military man with steady employment. They were married in a small ceremony in San Diego in December 1960. The young couple settled into a small one-bedroom apartment near the naval base. Their daughter, Laura, was born in October 1961. The arrival of their first child brought both joy and additional financial pressures. Brenda stopped working to care for the baby, making the family entirely dependent on Whitworth's military salary. A son, John, followed in March 1963. But beneath the surface of this apparently stable military career, Whitworth's marriage was troubled. According to later court testimony and interviews with people who knew the family, the relationship between Jerry and Brenda was marked by periods of tension, disagreements over money, and emotional distance. Whitworth spent long periods at sea, and when he returned home, he often seemed preoccupied or withdrawn. Brenda felt isolated raising two young children with minimal support. Money was a constant source of stress. By the early 1970s, the marriage had deteriorated significantly. Arguments became more frequent. Periods of separation became more common. In 1975, after 15 years of marriage, Jerry and Brenda Whitworth divorced. The divorce settlement included custody arrangements that split time with the children between both parents and established child support obligations of approximately $400 per month, a significant sum relative to his Navy salary at the time that would become a source of chronic financial stress. Laura was then 13 years old, and John was 12. According to later interviews with both children, the divorce was traumatic, but not entirely unexpected. They had grown up in a household characterized by tension and conflict. In the immediate aftermath of his divorce, Whitworth's financial situation became precarious. He was paying child support, maintaining his own residence, and trying to rebuild some semblance of personal life. In early 1976, he met Brenda Sue at a gathering of divorced military personnel, confusingly sharing a first name with his first wife. Brenda Sue was a divorced woman in her early 30s with two children from her previous marriage. She worked as a clerk at a department store and was struggling with her own financial difficulties. Jerry and Brenda Sue's relationship developed quickly, driven partly by genuine affection, but also by mutual financial need and the desire for companionship. They married in August 1976. The blended family created a household of 6: Jerry, Brenda Sue, Laura, and John from Jerry's first marriage, who visited on weekends, and Brenda Sue's 2 children, who lived with them full-time. The financial pressures were immense. Whitworth was now supporting his new wife and her children, paying child support for Laura and John, and maintaining a larger household with correspondingly higher expenses. Even with Brenda Sue's part-time income, money was extremely tight. Bills were often paid late. There were periods when they relied on credit cards to cover basic expenses. It was during this period of acute financial stress, in late 1974 or early 1975, that Jerry Whitworth encountered John Anthony Walker, Jr. under circumstances that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his life. John Walker, Jr., born in 1937, was 2 years older than Whitworth and was also a Navy radioman who had specialized in communications and cryptographic systems. The two men had known each other casually through their Navy service since the early 1960s, having served at some of the same facilities and on similar types of vessels. Their relationship had remained professional and relatively distant. What Whitworth did not know in 1974 was that John Walker had been engaged in espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union since 1967. Walker had initially been recruited by Soviet intelligence during a walk-in approach. He had literally walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to provide classified information in exchange for money. Over the following 7 years, Walker had provided the Soviets with extensive cryptographic materials, receiving substantial payments. By 1974, Walker was operating as what intelligence professionals call a principal agent, someone who not only provides information himself, but also recruits others to do the same. Soviet intelligence had encouraged Walker to expand his network. Walker began looking at his circle of acquaintances for potential recruits, people who had both access to valuable information and vulnerabilities that might make them receptive to recruitment. Jerry Whitworth fit the profile. He had extensive access to cryptographic materials. He held high-level security clearances. He was experiencing severe financial difficulties that were visible to anyone who knew him. And he had expressed, in casual conversations, frustration with his financial situation. According to Whitworth's later testimony, Walker approached him in late 1974 or early 1975 with what seemed at first to be an unusual business proposition. Walker suggested meeting for drinks at a bar near the naval base. During that meeting, Walker steered the conversation toward Whitworth's financial difficulties. Walker mentioned that he had been making significant amounts of additional money through a consulting arrangement that involved providing technical information to foreign clients. He described this in vague terms initially, emphasizing the substantial payments involved. The specifics of how Walker presented this proposition and how explicitly he described the true nature of the arrangement became a matter of intense legal dispute in later proceedings. What is certain from court records is that at some point between April and June 1975, Jerry Whitworth made the decision to provide classified materials to John Walker. The FBI's later investigation concluded that the first delivery of materials occurred sometime in this 3-month window. The mechanics of the arrangement were relatively straightforward, but required careful operational security. Whitworth, in his position as a senior radioman with extensive clearances, had regular access to cryptographic key lists, the codes and ciphers used to encrypt military communications. These key lists were among the most closely guarded secrets in the U.S. military. They contained the specific cryptographic keys used to encrypt radio communications between ships and shore stations, and between various commands. The security procedures governing cryptographic materials were extensive, at least in theory. Key lists were supposed to be stored in secure safes when not in use. Access was supposed to be logged. Key lists were supposed to remain in secure spaces at all times and never be removed. Periodic inventories were supposed to verify that all materials were accounted for. In practice, however, enforcement of these procedures in the 1970s, Navy was inconsistent. Senior radiomen like Whitworth, who had held their clearances for years and who had established reputations for reliability, were often given significant latitude. The volume of classified materials was enormous, making strict tracking difficult, and the culture within many communications units emphasized operational efficiency over security procedures. Whitworth exploited these gaps. He would access key lists as part of his normal duties. Instead of working with the materials only within secure spaces, he would place them in his briefcase, claiming he needed to review them elsewhere. He would then take the materials home, a clear violation of security regulations, but one that was difficult to detect. At home, he would photograph the materials using a camera that Walker had provided. Whitworth would set up the documents on a table, use adequate lighting, and systematically photograph each page. He would then return the materials to the secure facility the next day. The photographed materials would be delivered to Walker through various methods designed to minimize detection. Sometimes Whitworth and Walker would meet face-to-face in locations away from military facilities. Whitworth would pass Walker a package containing the film, and Walker would pass Whitworth an envelope containing cash payment. Other times, they would use dead drop techniques. Whitworth would leave a package containing film at a predetermined location, and Walker would retrieve it later, avoiding any direct contact. Walker would then pass the materials to his Soviet handlers through secure methods the KGB had provided. Walker would travel to locations in the Washington, D.C. area where Soviet intelligence officers operated under diplomatic cover. He would conduct dead drops, leaving packages at predetermined locations where Soviet officers would retrieve them. In return, Walker would receive substantial payments, typically thousands of dollars for each delivery. Walker kept the majority of these payments for himself, but provided Whitworth with a portion. According to financial records later obtained by investigators, Whitworth typically received between several hundred and several $1,000s per delivery. Over the course of his espionage, from 1975 through 1983, Whitworth would receive approximately $330,000 total. For Whitworth, the additional income initially seemed to solve his financial problems. His child support obligations were met on time. His household expenses became more manageable. He was able to pay down some credit card debt. He purchased a better car. He took his family on vacations that would have been difficult to afford on his Navy salary alone. The material improvements in his life were noticeable, but not so dramatic as to immediately raise suspicions. What Whitworth apparently did not fully grasp, or chose not to think about carefully, was the magnitude of the damage his espionage was causing. The cryptographic materials he provided allowed Soviet intelligence to decrypt U.S. Navy communications across multiple areas of operation. Soviet naval forces gained enormous advantages from this information. They could track the movements of American vessels. They could understand American tactical doctrine and operational procedures. They could identify vulnerabilities in American weapons systems and develop countermeasures. Throughout the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Whitworth continued his pattern of espionage, providing classified materials to Walker on a regular basis. His Navy assignments during this period placed him in positions with access to increasingly sensitive information. From 1975 to 1976, he served aboard the USS Niagara Falls, a combat stores ship. From 1976 to 1977, he was stationed at the Naval Communications Station in Diego Garcia, a remote island in the Indian Ocean that served as a critical relay point for military communications across a vast region. This assignment was particularly significant. Diego Garcia's communications station handled message traffic for American forces operating throughout the Indian Ocean region. The cryptographic materials Whitworth obtained from Diego Garcia gave Soviet military planners insight into how the U.S. military tracked Soviet vessels in the region and how American forces would respond to various contingencies. From 1977 to 1978, he served aboard the USS Constellation again during a deployment to the Western Pacific. The Constellation was an aircraft carrier, one of the Navy's most important assets, and the communications materials related to carrier operations were among the most sensitive in the fleet. From 1978 to 1982, he was assigned to the Naval Communications Station in Alameda, California. This shore station was a major communications hub on the West Coast, handling a high volume of classified message traffic for Pacific Fleet operations. Each of these assignments provided opportunities for Whitworth to obtain materials that Walker could pass to Soviet intelligence. The pattern continued with remarkable consistency. Whitworth would obtain materials, photograph them at home, pass the film to Walker through meetings or dead drops, and receive payment. The operational security practices they employed allowed the espionage to continue undetected for years. By 1983, when Whitworth was assigned back to the Naval Communications Station in Alameda in a new position, he had been engaged in espionage for approximately 8 years. This new assignment placed him in a supervisory role overseeing communications security procedures, an assignment that carried deep irony given his ongoing espionage activities. As a senior chief petty officer responsible for security, Whitworth was supposed to be ensuring that other personnel followed proper procedures for handling classified materials. He conducted security briefings, reviewed access logs, participated in security inspections, and counseled junior personnel on the importance of protecting classified information. All while he was systematically violating every security principle he was supposed to be enforcing. But it was also at Alameda that subtle changes in Whitworth's behavior began to attract the attention of colleagues and supervisors, setting in motion the chain of observations and suspicions that would eventually contribute to his exposure. Roger Chen, a 27-year-old cryptographic technician who had been assigned to the Alameda Station in January 1984, was the first person to notice unusual patterns in Whitworth's behavior and to report these observations through official channels. Chen had enlisted in the Navy in 1979 and had completed extensive training in communications security and cryptographic systems. He had been specifically instructed during his training to watch for potential insider threats. Chen noticed during his second week at the Alameda Station that Whitworth approached him at the end of a shift in late January 1984 and initiated a conversation about the procedures for handling and storing key lists. The conversation occurred in a common area of the communications facility. Whitworth, as a senior chief and security supervisor, had legitimate reasons to understand these procedures. But Chen noticed that Whitworth's questions focused particularly on specific details that seemed to go beyond what a supervisor would normally need to know. According to Chen's later testimony and the memo he wrote documenting the conversation, Whitworth asked detailed questions about how materials were accounted for, specifically what the procedures were for tracking materials when they were checked out of secure storage. He asked how often inventories were conducted and whether the inventories were comprehensive or sample-based. He asked what would happen if materials were found to be missing during an inventory. He asked about the access logs, who reviewed them, how often they were reviewed, and whether anyone ever followed up on unusual access patterns. The conversation itself was not necessarily inappropriate, but Chen felt uncomfortable about the level of detail Whitworth was seeking and about what seemed to be an underlying concern in Whitworth's questions, as if Whitworth was trying to understand how materials could be accessed without detection or how one might avoid getting caught if materials went missing. Chen mentioned the conversation to a colleague, Petty Officer Michael Torres, who suggested that Chen document the interaction. Chen wrote a brief memo to himself describing the interaction, noting the date, January 24, 1984, the approximate time, and the substance of Whitworth's questions. He filed this memo in his personal files but did not immediately report it to security officials. 3 weeks later, on February 14, 1984, Chen observed another incident that reinforced his concerns. Chen was working late in one of the station's secure spaces, completing an equipment maintenance log that was due the following morning. It was approximately 9:30 p.m. Chen was alone in the secure space, or so he thought, working at a terminal. The space was large, roughly 30 feet by 40 feet, and filled with equipment racks, filing cabinets, and workstations. The lighting was relatively dim. Chen looked up from his work and noticed that Whitworth was also in the space. Approximately 20 feet away in a corner area, partially obscured by equipment racks. Chen had not heard Whitworth enter. The door to the secure space was heavy and usually made an audible sound when opening, but Chen had been focused on his work and wearing headphones listening to music, so he had not noticed Whitworth's arrival. What caught Chen's attention was what Whitworth appeared to be doing. Chen observed Whitworth holding what looked like a small camera positioned above a document on the desk. The lighting made it difficult to see clearly, and Chen's view was partially obstructed by equipment, but the motion he observed was distinctive. Whitworth would hold the camera above the document for a moment, then set the camera down and reposition the document, turning a page or adjusting its position. Then he would pick up the camera again and hold it above the document again. The pattern repeated several times over the approximately 5 minutes that Chen observed. Photography of classified materials was strictly forbidden. Even possessing a camera in a secure space was a serious security violation. If what Chen was observing was indeed photography of classified documents, it represented potential espionage. Chen faced a difficult decision in that moment. He could confront Whitworth directly, but that would alert Whitworth if something inappropriate was occurring. He could report what he had seen immediately, but reporting a senior chief petty officer for potential espionage based on an observation made in dim lighting from a partially obstructed position was a serious step. He could try to get a better view, but any movement might alert Whitworth to his presence. Chen decided to remain at his workstation, trying not to draw attention to himself, and continued to observe peripherally. After approximately 5 minutes, Whitworth gathered the materials on his desk, placed them in folders, put the folders in his briefcase, picked up what appeared to be the camera, and placed it also in his briefcase, and left the secure space. Chen sat at his terminal for several minutes after Whitworth left, his heart racing, trying to process what he had observed. That night, Chen had difficulty sleeping. By the following morning, he had decided that he needed to report his observation. Over lunch at a restaurant in downtown Alameda, Chen described what he had observed to Torres. Torres listened carefully and asked several questions. Had Chen been certain it was a camera? Could it have been some other device? Chen acknowledged that he could not be 100% certain because of the lighting and the distance, but he maintained that what he had observed looked like photography. Torres agreed that the observation was concerning and advised Chen that he should report his observations to his chain of command. On February 17, 1984, 3 days after the observation, Chen approached his immediate supervisor, Lieutenant Patrick Sullivan. Sullivan was a 29-year-old communications officer who had been at the Alameda Station for approximately 1 year. Chen requested a private conversation, and Sullivan led Chen to his office and closed the door. In that meeting, Chen described both the January conversation about key list procedures and the February observation of what appeared to be photography in the secure space. Sullivan listened carefully, taking notes. He asked several follow-up questions about the specific details, the dates and times, and whether anyone else had witnessed either incident. Sullivan recognized that Chen's observations, particularly the potential photography in a secure space, were serious enough to warrant reporting to security officials. Sullivan told Chen that he had done the right thing by reporting his concerns. Sullivan explained that he would pass this information to the station security officer, Lieutenant Commander Harrison, who would determine what additional investigation was warranted. Sullivan also instructed Chen to continue his normal duties and to avoid discussing his observations with anyone else. Sullivan drafted a memorandum summarizing Chen's report, classified it as secret due to the nature of the allegations, and hand-carried it to Lieutenant Commander Harrison's office that same afternoon. Harrison read the memo with immediate concern. Allegations of photography in secure spaces were among the most serious indicators of potential espionage. However, Harrison faced practical constraints in how he could investigate without alerting Whitworth. He could not simply confront Whitworth directly, because if Whitworth was engaged in espionage, such a confrontation would alert him that he was under suspicion. He could not place Whitworth under overt surveillance within the facility. He could not search Whitworth's workspace or his home without probable cause and without a warrant. What Harrison could do was initiate what the Navy called a quiet inquiry, a discreet information-gathering process that involved reviewing records, interviewing personnel who worked with the subject, and watching for additional indicators while avoiding any action that would alert the subject. Over the following 3 weeks, Harrison conducted a series of conversations with various personnel at the Alameda Station. He framed these conversations as part of a routine security review rather than as an investigation of a specific individual. During these conversations, 2 additional reports emerged. Patricia Gonzalez, a 33-year-old petty officer first class who served as a watch supervisor, mentioned to Harrison during a conversation on March 5, 1984, that she had noticed on several occasions that Whitworth remained in secure spaces after his official shift had ended. She had not thought much of this at the time. Senior personnel often worked extended hours. But when Harrison asked whether she had observed what Whitworth was doing during these extended periods, Gonzalez acknowledged that she had not directly observed his activities. Thomas Reeves, a 41-year-old chief warrant officer responsible for facilities maintenance and physical security systems, mentioned to Harrison during a conversation on March 8, 1984, that he had observed Whitworth carrying his briefcase into restricted areas more frequently than seemed typical for someone in a supervisory role. Most senior personnel left their briefcases in their offices when entering secure spaces. But Reeves had observed Whitworth carrying his briefcase into secure spaces on at least 4 or 5 occasions over the previous 2 months. By early March 1984, Harrison's log contained 5 separate entries relating to Whitworth. Unusual questions to Chen about key list procedures, possible photography observed by Chen, multiple observations by Gonzalez of extended time in secure spaces after hours, and multiple observations by Reeves of briefcase practices. While none of these entries alone constituted definitive evidence of espionage, the pattern was suggestive enough that Harrison decided formal investigation by professional counterintelligence investigators was warranted. On March 8, 1984, Harrison placed a telephone call to the Naval Investigative Service Office in San Francisco. He spoke with Special Agent Thomas Bradley, a counterintelligence investigator with 12 years of experience. Harrison explained that he was calling about a potential security matter that required counterintelligence expertise and requested a face-to-face meeting. Bradley agreed to meet with Harrison the following day. On March 9, 1984, Bradley traveled to the Alameda Station and met with Harrison in a secure conference room. Harrison presented his informal log and described each of the observations in detail. Bradley listened carefully, taking extensive notes and asking numerous clarifying questions. Bradley's assessment was that the observations Harrison had compiled were concerning enough to warrant a formal NIS investigation. The possible photography observation was particularly significant. Bradley told Harrison that NIS would assign agents to begin gathering additional information and conducting surveillance, but he emphasized the need for absolute discretion. Bradley instructed Harrison to continue his normal duties and to report any additional observations. The NIS investigation of Jerry Whitworth officially began on March 12, 1984. Special Agent Bradley was designated as the case agent, and additional investigators were assigned to support the investigation. Bradley reviewed Whitworth's personnel file, his security clearance file, and his financial disclosure forms. What Bradley found in Whitworth's financial records was immediately significant. The information Whitworth had provided on his financial disclosure forms showed relatively modest assets. However, Bradley's experience told him that financial disclosure forms were not always accurate. Bradley contacted the Naval Investigative Service's Financial Investigation Unit and requested a more comprehensive review of Whitworth's banking records. Bank records showed that Whitworth's checking account had received deposits over the previous several years that appeared inconsistent with his Navy salary and his wife's reported income. These deposits were not enormous, typically ranging from a few $100 to a few $1,000s at irregular intervals, but they were difficult to explain. When Bradley reviewed Whitworth's income tax returns, obtained through coordination with the Internal Revenue Service, he found that Whitworth had not reported any significant income beyond his military pay and his wife's wages. The unexplained bank deposits suggested unreported income from an unknown source. Bradley expanded the investigation to include surveillance of Whitworth's activities both on and off the naval base. Beginning in late March 1984, NIS agents began monitoring Whitworth's movements. The surveillance was conducted discreetly, with agents using unmarked vehicles, civilian clothing, and techniques designed to avoid detection. For the first several weeks, the surveillance produced relatively mundane results. Whitworth went to work, performed his duties, returned home, spent evenings with his family. However, on April 23, 1984, NIS surveillance detected activity that significantly elevated the investigation's priority. That afternoon, at approximately 2:15 p.m., Whitworth left the Alameda Station during what appeared to be a routine lunch break. Instead of driving to one of his usual lunch locations, he drove north across the Carquinez Bridge and into Contra Costa County. Agents followed at a distance. Whitworth drove to a large shopping mall in Concord, approximately 25 miles from the Alameda Station. Whitworth parked his vehicle and entered through one of the main entrances. NIS agents on foot surveillance followed him into the mall, maintaining distance. According to surveillance logs, Whitworth walked through several stores but did not make any purchases. His movements appeared purposeful but also somewhat cautious, as if he was checking to see whether he was being followed. He occasionally paused to look in store windows, which allowed him to observe the reflection and see who was behind him. He walked through the food court, purchased a soft drink, sat at a table for approximately 5 minutes, then exited the mall through a different door. After exiting the mall, Whitworth walked across the parking lot and into a small park adjacent to the shopping center. The park featured a playground, several benches, and walking paths. It was a pleasant spring afternoon, and there were several other people in the park. According to the surveillance report, Whitworth walked along one of the paths for approximately 50 yards, then sat on a bench near a cluster of trees. He appeared to be carrying a newspaper. Whitworth sat on the bench for approximately 15 minutes. He appeared to read the newspaper, holding it in front of him and occasionally turning pages. The agents conducting foot surveillance positioned themselves at distances ranging from 30 to 75 yards. At approximately 3:05 p.m., Whitworth stood up, folded the newspaper, and placed it on the bench beside where he had been sitting rather than taking it with him. He then walked back toward the parking lot. The agents observed that approximately 10 minutes after Whitworth had departed, at approximately 3:15 p.m., another man approached the bench from a different direction. This man was described in surveillance reports as appearing to be in his late 30s or early 40s, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark hair, wearing a light-colored jacket and jeans. He walked past the bench, paused, then returned and sat down on the same bench. He picked up the newspaper that Whitworth had left, opened it briefly as if examining it, then folded it and carried it with him as he walked away. The NIS agents photographed this man and attempted to follow him, but they faced a difficult tactical decision. If they followed the unknown man too closely, they risked being detected. If they allowed Whitworth to drive away without surveillance, they would lose track of their primary subject. The decision was made to maintain surveillance on Whitworth while attempting to photograph and document the unknown man's vehicle and license plate. This incident at the Concord Mall and Park matched a pattern consistent with a dead drop operation, a classic espionage technique in which an asset leaves materials at a predetermined location and a handler retrieves them later, avoiding direct contact. The newspaper Whitworth had left could have contained anything: cash, instructions, film containing photographs of classified materials, or simply a signal. To any casual observer, the incident would have appeared entirely innocent. Bradley recognized the pattern immediately. This was almost certainly a dead drop, which meant that Whitworth was likely engaged in active espionage. Bradley intensified the investigation, directing additional agents to monitor Whitworth more closely and to attempt to identify the unknown man. Agents began monitoring Whitworth's personal telephone line, obtaining the necessary legal authorization based on the evidence already gathered. For several weeks following the Concord incident, the investigation continued but produced no additional definitive evidence. Whitworth's monitored telephone conversations consisted primarily of routine domestic matters. Whitworth's movements followed patterns similar to those before the Concord incident. There were no additional observed meetings that suggested dead drop operations. The investigation appeared to have reached a plateau. Then, in May 1984, events began to unfold elsewhere that would ultimately prove far more significant. In Massachusetts, approximately 3,000 miles from Alameda, Barbara Walker was living in Saugus, a small city north of Boston. Barbara, 47 years old, was the ex-wife of John Walker. She and John had divorced in 1976 after 18 years of marriage. The divorce had been acrimonious. After the divorce, Barbara had struggled. She had custody of her daughter but limited financial resources. She worked various jobs but never achieved financial stability. She drank heavily, using alcohol to cope with depression, loneliness, and guilt. The guilt was related to her gradual realization over the years following her divorce that John had been engaged in espionage and that she had remained silent about her suspicions. During their marriage, John had occasionally made comments that suggested he was providing information to someone in exchange for money. By 1984, Barbara's silence about John's activities had become unbearable. She was tormented by the knowledge that her ex-husband might be betraying the country and that her son might be involved. On May 16, 1984, after spending several hours drinking vodka in her apartment, Barbara made an impulsive decision. She picked up the telephone and called the FBI. The call was received at the FBI's Boston field office at approximately 8:45 p.m. The duty agent who answered heard a woman who was clearly intoxicated, speaking rapidly and sometimes incoherently, making dramatic allegations about her ex-husband being a Soviet spy. The agent attempted to get more details: the woman's name, her ex-husband's name, specific information about his activities, but Barbara was emotional and disorganized. She said her ex-husband's name was John Walker, that he had been in the Navy, that he was providing classified information to the Soviets, that he had been doing it for years, and that he had recruited their son and other people. The call lasted approximately 8 minutes before Barbara abruptly hung up. The Boston FBI office opened a file on Barbara Walker's call. The initial assessment was skeptical. The call had come from an intoxicated woman making dramatic allegations about an ex-spouse. However, FBI protocols required that any allegation of espionage be investigated. Over the following days, FBI agents in Boston attempted to contact Barbara Walker again. On May 19, 1984, 3 days after her initial telephone call, Barbara agreed to meet with FBI agents at her apartment. This time, she was sober and able to provide more coherent information. She described John's activities in significant detail: his sudden acquisition of money in the late 1960s and early 1970s, his purchase of expensive items that seemed beyond his Navy salary, his secretive trips, his statements to her during their marriage about working with the Soviets. She described his recruitment of their son Michael in the early 1980s. She mentioned that John had also recruited other Navy friends, including someone named Jerry Whitworth, whom she had met once or twice but did not know well. The mention of Jerry Whitworth's name immediately caught the attention of the FBI agents. After the interview concluded, the agents immediately contacted FBI headquarters in Washington to report that they had a potentially credible source, alleging that a Navy communications specialist named John Walker had been engaged in espionage and had recruited someone named Jerry Whitworth. FBI headquarters conducted a database search for Jerry Whitworth and discovered that the Naval Investigative Service had an active investigation of a Senior Chief Radioman named Jerry Alfred Whitworth, stationed at the Naval Communications Station in Alameda, California. The two investigations were now connected. What had been two separate threads were suddenly revealed to be part of the same case. The FBI and NIS immediately coordinated their investigations, sharing information and resources. The combined investigation now had a much clearer picture. John Walker was likely the principal agent who had recruited Jerry Whitworth. The pattern of espionage likely extended beyond just Whitworth to potentially multiple individuals. The investigation of John Walker proceeded rapidly, with the FBI placing him under intensive surveillance and tracking his movements. Walker, who had retired from the Navy in 1976 after 20 years of service, was now living in Norfolk, Virginia, where he operated a private detective agency and a bar. Walker was still actively engaged in espionage, receiving materials from his network and passing them to Soviet intelligence. On May 20th, 1985, approximately 1 year after Barbara Walker's initial call, agents observed John Walker conducting a dead-drop operation on a rural road in Maryland. Walker drove to a location near the Potomac River, stopped his vehicle, walked into a wooded area beside the road, and placed a package near a utility pole. He then returned to his vehicle and drove away. FBI agents who had been conducting surveillance from concealed positions immediately moved in and arrested Walker. A search of his vehicle found extensive materials related to his espionage activities: cryptographic documents, communications equipment for contacting Soviet handlers, instructions for future dead drops, and records of payments. Walker's arrest triggered immediate coordinated action against other members of his network. On May 22, 1985, FBI and Navy investigators arrested Michael Walker aboard the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. Michael, 22 years old at the time of his arrest, had been recruited by his father in 1982. On May 28, 1985, FBI agents arrested Arthur Walker, John's brother, at his residence in Virginia Beach, Virginia. Arthur had worked as a contractor for VSE Corporation, a defense company with contracts involving ship repair and maintenance for the Navy. And on June 3, 1985, FBI and NIS agents arrived at Jerry Whitworth's residence in Alameda, California, to place him under arrest. The decision had been made to arrest all known members of the Walker network simultaneously to prevent any member from learning of other arrests and fleeing or destroying evidence. According to FBI reports from the arresting agents, Whitworth answered the door at approximately 6:30 a.m. when agents knocked. Whitworth was still in pajamas, having been awakened by the knocking. His wife, Brenda, was also awakened and came to the door. When informed that he was under arrest for espionage, Whitworth's face went pale, his hands began to shake, and he appeared to have difficulty speaking. He leaned against the doorframe as if his legs might not support him. His first words were, "Oh, God! Oh, my God!" His wife, Brenda, began crying and asking repeatedly what was happening, insisting there must be some mistake. Agents allowed Whitworth to get dressed under supervision, then placed him in handcuffs and escorted him to a vehicle. Other agents remained at the residence to conduct a search under the authority of the arrest warrant. Whitworth was transported to the FBI field office in San Francisco, where he was placed in an interrogation room. He was read his Miranda rights. Initially, Whitworth invoked his right to remain silent and stated that he wanted to speak with an attorney. He was provided with a telephone and allowed to call a lawyer who agreed to represent him and who instructed Whitworth not to answer any questions. Whitworth sat in the interrogation room for several hours. At approximately 2:30 p.m., agents informed Whitworth that John Walker had been arrested and was cooperating with investigators. This was designed to encourage the suspect to provide his own account. At approximately 3:15 p.m., before his attorney had arrived, Whitworth requested to speak with the agents. He waived his right to have his attorney present and agreed to answer questions. The interrogation of Jerry Whitworth, conducted over multiple sessions during the first week of June 1985, produced detailed admissions. According to interrogation transcripts, Whitworth acknowledged that he had provided classified materials to John Walker over approximately 8 years, from 1975 through 1983. He described the mechanics of how he had photographed documents using a camera Walker provided, the various locations where he had met Walker or left materials, and the total payments received. When asked why he had engaged in espionage, Whitworth emphasized his financial difficulties following his divorce, his child support obligations, and his need to support a blended family after his second marriage. FBI investigators noted numerous inconsistencies between his account and evidence obtained from Walker and from searches. One particularly significant discovery from the search of Whitworth's home was a collection of letters he had written but never mailed. These letters, found in a desk drawer, were addressed to John Walker and appeared to have been drafted in late 1984 and early 1985. The letters expressed anger about inadequate compensation. In one letter, dated January 1985, Whitworth wrote, "I have been thinking about our arrangement, and I have concluded that I have not been fairly compensated for the materials I have provided. Based on the quality and sensitivity of what I have given you over the years, I believe I should have received at least $400,000, possibly more. I know you are keeping the majority of the payments you receive, and I think that is unfair. I want to discuss a better arrangement going forward, or I may need to reconsider whether I can continue." In another letter, Whitworth wrote, "I am taking significant risks by obtaining this material, and I deserve to be compensated appropriately for those risks. You are operating as a middleman and keeping most of the money while I am the one with direct access to the materials. This needs to change. I want 50% of whatever you receive, not the small amounts you have been giving me." These letters directly contradicted Whitworth's claims that he had wanted to stop his espionage activities. They instead suggested that Whitworth's primary concern was receiving more money for his continued espionage. The federal prosecution of the Walker spy ring proceeded through multiple separate but coordinated cases. John Walker, facing overwhelming evidence, agreed to plead guilty in exchange for certain concessions. The primary concession Walker sought was a reduced sentence for his son, Michael. Walker agreed to plead guilty to all charges, to cooperate fully with investigators, and to forego any appeals. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to recommend a sentence of 25 years rather than life imprisonment for Michael. Michael Walker pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit espionage. His defense attorney emphasized his youth and argued that he had been manipulated by his father. The court accepted the plea agreement, and Michael was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. Arthur Walker also pleaded guilty and received a life sentence. Jerry Whitworth was the only member of the ring to proceed to trial. His defense attorneys mounted a defense that acknowledged Whitworth had provided classified materials to Walker, but argued that he had done so without fully understanding that the materials were going to the Soviet Union. The prosecution's case was devastating. Prosecutors presented evidence of Whitworth's extensive access to highly sensitive cryptographic materials, testimony from Navy and NSA experts about the specific materials and their significance, the camera and photographic equipment found during searches, financial records showing the deposits, the letters complaining about inadequate payment, John Walker's testimony describing the recruitment and materials provided, and testimony from Chen, Gonzalez, and Reeves about the observations that initiated the investigation. The damage assessment became one of the most significant pieces of evidence. On September 23, 1986, Vice Admiral John Butts, Director of Naval Intelligence, testified about the impact. According to Vice Admiral Butts, the materials provided by the Walker ring, with Whitworth being a major contributor of highly sensitive cryptographic materials, had compromised every operational plan, every weapons system capability, and every tactical doctrine of the U.S. Navy during the period of the espionage. The Vice Admiral testified that Soviet naval forces, having access to American cryptographic key lists, would have been able to read encrypted American military communications across multiple areas of operation. This would have given Soviet commanders insight into American ship movements, operational plans, tactical procedures, intelligence collection activities, and weapons system capabilities. The Vice Admiral stated that in the event of military conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union, the compromised communications would have given Soviet forces overwhelming advantages that would likely have resulted in significant American casualties and potential defeat in naval engagements. On August 9, 1986, after a trial lasting 6 weeks and deliberations lasting approximately 7 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts against Jerry Whitworth. The charges included conspiracy to commit espionage, multiple counts of providing classified information to unauthorized persons, and violations of laws protecting national defense information. Sentencing proceedings took place over several days in November 1986. The prosecution argued for the maximum possible sentence, emphasizing the unprecedented damage, the fact that he had been motivated primarily by greed, and the evidence from his own letters. The defense argued for a sentence less than life imprisonment, citing Whitworth's cooperation, his lack of any prior criminal record, and his expressed remorse. Defense attorneys called Whitworth's children as witnesses. Laura Whitworth, who testified reluctantly, told the court that while she was devastated by what her father had done, she hoped the court would show some mercy. On November 12, 1986, federal judge John P. Vukasin Jr. announced Whitworth's sentence. Judge Vukasin stated that the case represented one of the most serious breaches of national security in American history. He noted that Whitworth had betrayed a position of trust, had provided highly sensitive information to a hostile foreign power over many years, and had done so primarily for financial gain. Judge Vukasin sentenced Jerry Whitworth to 365 years in federal prison, effectively multiple life sentences. The sentence was more severe than the prosecution had recommended, reflecting the judge's view that the extraordinary nature of the offense warranted extraordinary punishment. John Walker had received a life sentence with no possibility of parole. Michael Walker was serving his 25-year sentence. Arthur Walker was serving a life sentence. The immediate impact on Jerry Whitworth's family was devastating. Brenda Whitworth, who had testified at trial that she had no knowledge of her husband's espionage activities and who was never charged with any crime, filed for divorce shortly after the sentencing. The divorce was finalized in March 1987. Brenda reverted to her maiden name and relocated with her children to another state. Whitworth's daughter Laura and son John from his first marriage, who were 25 and 23 years old respectively at the time of their father's arrest, both experienced profound and lasting psychological impacts. According to later interviews Laura gave to researchers, she had always viewed her father as a dedicated Navy man who took pride in his service. Learning that he had been betraying that service for money shattered her understanding of who her father was. Laura described going through stages of response: initial disbelief, then anger, then grief for the father she thought she had known, but who apparently had never really existed. She described the shame of having her father's crimes publicized, of having her name associated with espionage. She described practical impacts: difficulties finding employment because background checks revealed her father's conviction, difficulties in relationships. Most painfully, she described her internal conflict about whether to maintain any relationship with her father. She visited him in prison once, approximately 2 years after his incarceration began. The visit was awkward and painful. After that visit, she decided she could not maintain a relationship with him. She never visited or communicated with him again. John Whitworth had a somewhat different response. In interviews given years later, John described feeling both betrayed by his father's actions and sympathetic to his father's situation. He acknowledged that his father had committed serious crimes, but he also believed that the 365-year sentence was excessively harsh. John visited his father in prison occasionally during the first few years, approximately 4 or 5 times over a 3-year period. But these visits became emotionally draining. Eventually, around 1990, John stopped visiting as well, though he occasionally sent letters. The co-workers who had reported suspicious observations, Chen, Gonzalez, and Reeves, all received commendations from both the Navy and the FBI for their vigilance. Chen, in particular, was recognized as having played a crucial role in initiating the investigation. However, Chen later described the recognition as bittersweet. In a 1989 interview with a military newspaper, he reflected that while he was proud to have done his duty and glad that the investigation had stopped ongoing espionage, he also felt a sense of guilt about the role he had played in destroying a colleague's life. Chen said he rationally understood that Whitworth had been engaged in serious crimes and deserved punishment, but emotionally he still struggled with having initiated a chain of events that ended with another human being receiving a 365-year sentence. The broader institutional impact was significant. The Department of Defense and the Navy implemented comprehensive reviews of personnel security procedures. New protocols were established requiring more frequent security reviews, enhanced monitoring of access to classified materials, and mandatory reporting of suspicious behaviors. The Navy implemented specific technical controls to better track access to cryptographic key lists. Electronic monitoring systems were installed in secure spaces. The two-person integrity rule was enforced more strictly. Background investigations for security clearances were expanded to include more thorough financial reviews. Training programs were revamped to include more extensive coverage of espionage indicators. Jerry Whitworth began serving. His sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Allenwood, Pennsylvania. According to prison records, his behavior during incarceration was generally compliant. He was not involved in disciplinary incidents. He participated in educational programs, completed coursework, and worked in the prison library. Whitworth gave occasional interviews to journalists and researchers over the years. Though his accounts remain self-serving, he maintained that he had not fully understood the implications when he began. He emphasized his financial difficulties. He expressed remorse, but often qualified it with complaints about his sentence. In 2008, at age 68, Whitworth filed a petition for clemency. The petition argued that he had served more than 20 years, that his continued incarceration served no purpose given his age and health problems, and that humanitarian considerations warranted his release. The clemency petition was denied in 2009. Whitworth filed additional petitions in 2011 and 2015. Both were denied. John Walker died in federal prison in July 2014 at age 77, having served nearly 30 years. Michael Walker was released in February 2000 after serving 15 years. He changed his name and attempted to rebuild his life. Arthur Walker died in federal prison in July 2014 at age 80, having served 29 years. In a 2012 interview conducted by a documentary filmmaker, Jerry Whitworth, then 72 years old and in declining health, spoke about his espionage with a mixture of defensiveness and resignation. He acknowledged that what he had done was wrong and that he had betrayed his oath and his country. But he continued to emphasize his financial problems as explanatory factors. When the interviewer asked him directly whether he believed his espionage had caused actual harm, whether American sailors or military operations had been endangered, Whitworth was silent for a long moment before responding. He finally said that he did not know and that he preferred not to think about it in those terms. He said that during his espionage activities, he had focused on the abstract nature of the materials and had not allowed himself to think about what Soviet intelligence might do with that information. He said that after his arrest, when he heard the damage assessments, he began to understand the implications. But even then, it remained somewhat abstract because there had not been an actual war where the compromised communications led to direct casualties. The interviewer pressed further, asking whether Whitworth believed he deserved the 365-year sentence. Whitworth responded that he thought the sentence was excessive and punitive, designed more to send a message than to serve any legitimate purpose of justice. He noted that other espionage defendants had received shorter sentences. He believed his sentence had been influenced by the publicity and by the desire to punish the Walker ring severely. When asked what he would say to the families of sailors who had served during the period when Soviet intelligence was reading American naval communications, Whitworth became emotional. He said he was sorry for any harm he had caused and that he had not intended to endanger anyone. He said that if he could go back and make different choices, he would. But he also said that apologies were inadequate and that he understood if those families could not forgive him. The question of responsibility in cases like Jerry Whitworth's involves multiple layers of causation and culpability that cannot be reduced to simple judgments about guilt and punishment. Whitworth bears primary responsibility for his own choices. He chose to betray his oath and provide classified materials to John Walker, knowing or having strong reason to believe that the materials were going to a foreign power. He chose to accept payments. He chose to continue this pattern for 8 years. He chose to write letters demanding more money rather than confessing. These were his choices, made of his own volition, and he bears responsibility for them and for their consequences. However, the case also reveals systemic failures that enabled Whitworth's espionage to continue for as long as it did. Security protocols in the 1970s and early 1980s, Navy were inadequate to detect and prevent insider threats effectively. Personnel with access to highly sensitive materials were not monitored closely enough. Background investigations were insufficient to identify financial vulnerabilities. Security procedures that existed on paper were not enforced consistently in practice. These systemic failures did not cause Whitworth's espionage, but they created conditions that allowed espionage to proceed undetected for years. The role of co-worker observations in eventually exposing Whitworth's activities highlights an important dimension of counterintelligence: the value of ordinary vigilance and the willingness of individuals to report concerns. Chen's observations of unusual questions and apparent photography, Gonzalez's notice of extended time in secure spaces, Reeves's observation of briefcase practices, these were small details that individually might mean nothing but that collectively formed a pattern. The fact that these individuals reported their observations rather than dismissing them was crucial. Yet, as Chen's earlier comments suggested, there is something unsettling about this aspect of the case. The exposure of espionage through co-worker surveillance represents a necessary security measure. But it also reflects an environment of suspicion and monitoring in which colleagues watch each other and report behaviors that might have innocent explanations. The impact on the families of convicted spies represents another dimension of the human cost that extends far beyond the individuals who commit the acts. These individuals, Brenda rebuilding her life, Laura severing contact, John struggling with conflict, bore no responsibility for Jerry Whitworth's choices. They had no knowledge of his espionage. They had no opportunity to stop him. Yet they experienced devastating consequences: loss of family relationships, social stigma, psychological trauma, practical difficulties in employment and relationships. Jerry Whitworth has spent more than 35 years in custody. His health has declined significantly. He suffers from diabetes, heart disease, and other age-related conditions. He requires ongoing medical care and uses a wheelchair for mobility. The Cold War that provided the context for his betrayal ended in 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The Soviet intelligence service he ultimately served no longer exists in its Cold War form. The Navy he betrayed has been transformed multiple times over by technological advances. The cryptographic materials he provided, the key lists and ciphers that were so valuable to Soviet intelligence in the 1970s and 1980s, became obsolete within a decade as cryptographic technology advanced and as the systems he had compromised were replaced. The specific ships and weapons systems that his information helped Soviet intelligence understand have been retired and replaced. But the real tragedy extends far beyond his personal loss and far beyond the quantifiable damage to national security. It includes his daughter Laura, who lost her father and spent decades grappling with shame and trying to understand how someone she loved could have done what he did. It includes his son John, who maintained some contact but struggled with the burden. It includes Brenda, who lost her husband and had to rebuild her life. It includes his colleagues who felt betrayed by someone they had worked alongside and trusted. It includes the unknown number of American military personnel who served during the period when Soviet intelligence was reading American naval communications. It includes the degradation of trust within military communications facilities, where the knowledge that a trusted insider with an exemplary record could betray so comprehensively made everyone more suspicious. The observation that Roger Chen made and reported on February 14, 1984, captured a pattern that would contribute to unraveling a Soviet intelligence operation and sending a man to prison for the rest of his life. But observations can only document surfaces, the visible behaviors, the suspicious patterns, the unusual activities. They cannot capture the complex motivations that led someone to betray, the rationalizations that allowed them to continue despite periodic doubts, or the consequences that rippled outward through families and institutions. Jerry Whitworth was 36 years old when the first reports about his suspicious behavior were made by colleagues in early 1984. He was 45 when he was convicted and sentenced to die in prison. He is now over 80, having spent more than 3/4 of his adult life in custody. The context of his crimes has vanished. The Soviet Union dissolved, the Cold War ended, the technologies and systems he compromised became historical artifacts. What remains is an old man in prison, the damaged families he left behind, and the unresolved questions about how people come to commit extraordinary betrayals, what it means to hold them accountable for consequences that extend far beyond what any court can address, and whether justice can ever truly be achieved when the harm caused is so diffuse and long-lasting that it becomes impossible to measure or remediate.